How does a nation cope when its golden-haired hero gets wiped off the map? Simple. You invent a villain worthy of the failure. To explain the disaster at Little Bighorn, America didn't look at Custer's bad decisions. Instead, a writer cooked up a secret military genius, a phantom mastermind leading the Sioux. It was the perfect solution to an embarrassing problem, creating a legendary enemy to excuse a legendary screw-up. The only issue is that this genius never actually existed. The Battle of the Little Bighorn wasn't just a battle. For the United States in its centennial year of 1876, it was a national humiliation, a shock to the system so profound that it would be felt for generations. This wasn't a remote skirmish, it was a meticulously executed defeat of a premier cavalry regiment, led by a man who was a living celebrity. The story of how it happened begins not with a bugle call, but with a broken promise, a lust for gold, and a government that had written a contract it had no intention of honoring, setting the stage for one of the most lopsided and stunning upsets in American military history. The foundation for the conflict was built on paper and bad faith. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 was one of those grand, poetic documents governments love to sign. It guaranteed the Lakota Sioux ownership of the Black Hills, their sacred Paha Sapa, forever. The language was absolute, promising the land would be theirs as long as the grass grows and the water flows. It was a beautiful sentiment, but in the cynical machinery of westward expansion, such promises were merely temporary obstacles. The treaty held just long enough for the ink to dry. In 1874, a military expedition led by none other than Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer confirmed rumors of gold in the heart of the Black Hills. The announcement acted like a starter pistol, and a flood of thousands of white prospectors illegally stormed the sacred land, carving it up for profit. The grass was still growing, but a new, more powerful currency was now flowing: gold. Faced with a crisis of its own making, the U.S. government chose an aggressive path. Instead of evicting the thousands of illegal miners, it decided to evict the legal landowners. In the 18th of December 75, it issued an ultimatum that was as absurd as it was cruel. All Sioux and Cheyenne bands off the established reservations had to report to their designated agencies by the 31st of January, 1876, or be declared hostile. It was a demand made with zero regard for reality. Forcing thousands of people, including women, children, and the elderly, to travel hundreds of miles across the frozen northern plains in the dead of winter was not a request. It was a declaration of war disguised as a bureaucratic deadline. It was the government manufacturing consent to use force, creating an enemy by issuing an order it knew could not be obeyed. This set the two forces on a direct collision course. On one side was the 7th Cavalry Regiment, Custer's command, a force of roughly 650 men. They weren't a monolith. The regiment was a cross-section of America, filled with recent immigrants from Ireland and Germany, grizzled veterans from both the Union and Confederate armies, and young men seeking adventure. Their official mission was to enforce the government's ultimatum and push the hostile bands back to the reservations. On the other side was a power the U.S. Army had consistently underestimated. A massive alliance of Lakota Sioux, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho had gathered in defiance. This was not just a war party, it was one of the largest gatherings of native peoples on the Great Plains, a sprawling village of around 7,000 people, with an estimated 1,500 to 2,500 warriors ready to defend them. They were led by men of incredible stature. Sitting Bull, the great Hunkpapa Lakota spiritual leader who had prophesied a great victory. Crazy Horse, the visionary Oglala Lakota war chief whose tactical brilliance was legendary. And Gall, a fearsome Hunkpapa strategist. They weren't hostiles. They were a nation mobilized for war, fighting for the ground beneath their feet. When a story is too ugly, too embarrassing, or too confusing to accept, we have a tendency to rewrite it. The absolute destruction of George Custer's command at the Little Bighorn was a national trauma that defied easy explanation. The official narrative simply didn't compute. How could a celebrated Civil War hero and his elite cavalry be so utterly erased by a supposedly inferior foe? This void of understanding became a fertile ground for fiction, a space where writers, showmen, and opportunists could plant new stories. These were tales designed to soothe a wounded national ego, to create order from chaos, and, not coincidentally, to make a quick buck. In the months and years following the battle, a series of powerful myths emerged, each one attempting to reshape the humiliating truth into something more palatable, more heroic, or at least more sensational. The two most prominent fabrications were the invention of a phantom military genius to make the loss seem honorable, and the endless parade of fake soul survivors who claimed to have cheated death. The first and perhaps most insidious legend was born just months after the battle, from the pen of a man who understood drama better than he understood history. Frederick Whitaker was a prolific author of dime novels, the cheap, sensationalist paperbacks of the day that served as the 19th century's version of blockbuster action movies. In his instant biography, A Complete Life of General George A. Custer, Whitaker was faced with the same problem as the American public: how to explain the inexplicable. His solution was not to analyze Custer's tactical blunders or credit the brilliance of the Lakota and Cheyenne leadership. Instead, he invented an antagonist. He created a character, a phantom mastermind he named Bison. According to Whitaker's dramatic tale, Bison was a mysterious, dark-skinned young man, possibly of mixed heritage, who had once been a cadet at West Point. After being expelled for conflicts with his superiors, he supposedly rejected the white world, joined the Cheyenne, married the daughter of a chief, and rose to become their supreme military commander. Whitaker didn't just suggest this character existed. He asserted that it was Bison's genius, and his alone, that had engineered the entire sophisticated strategy that trapped and annihilated Custer's forces. He was portrayed as a tragic, brooding anti-hero, a military prodigy who used his American military education against his own people. It was a fantastic story with all the elements of a best-selling novel: mystery, betrayal, and a worthy yet familiar adversary. The only problem is that Bison was a complete work of fiction. There is not a single piece of historical evidence, not one Lakota or Cheyenne oral history, not one army record that supports the existence of such a person. He was a ghost conjured for a very specific purpose. For one, his existence made the U.S. Army's failure easier to swallow. It was far more honorable to be defeated by a rogue West Point genius than by leaders the government had dismissed as uneducated savages. The story of Bison is soaked in the casual racism of the era, built on the assumption that the native warriors could not have possibly developed such a complex and successful battle plan on their own. They needed a leader with the intellectual pedigree of a white institution to make their victory believable to a white audience. Furthermore, the story was a commercial masterstroke. It transformed a messy, chaotic battle into a clean narrative duel between two brilliant commanders, Custer the hero and Bison the fallen genius. It sold books and shaped public perception for decades, a powerful testament to how easily a compelling lie can displace an inconvenient truth. While Whitaker was inventing a fake villain, a whole host of other opportunists were busy inventing fake heroes, specifically themselves. The fact that all 210 men in Custer's immediate command were killed created an irresistible temptation for storytellers and con artists. The idea of being the sole survivor of Custer's Last Stand was a ticket to instant fame and a reliable source of free drinks in any saloon in the country. Dozens of men would claim the title over the years, but a few became particularly famous for their tales. The most persistent and detailed claim came from a man named Frank Finkel. He surfaced years after the battle with an elaborate story, claiming he had been a private in Custer's Company C. He recounted that during the chaos, his horse was struck by a bullet and bolted, carrying him uncontrollably away from the fighting. Wounded and delirious, he claimed to have wandered the plains for days before being rescued by fur traders. Finkel's story was convincing enough to persuade his wife and neighbors, and his case has been debated for over a century. However, his name appears on none of the official rosters of the 7th Cavalry. Supporters argue he likely enlisted under a false name, a common practice at the time. But professional historians, most notably Robert M. Utley, have systematically dismantled his claim, pointing out numerous inconsistencies and a complete lack of verifiable proof. Finkel's tale remains a masterclass in historical gaslighting, a story so well told that it almost feels true. Other claimants were far less subtle. A man named Raymond Gardner, a performer who went by the stage name Arizona Bill, simply incorporated a survival story into his Wild West show act for marketing purposes. He told cheering crowds that he had been one of Custer's scouts and was sent away with a message moments before the final attack, thus narrowly escaping the fate of his comrades. It was pure fiction, a baseless claim designed to add a veneer of authenticity to his performance and sell more tickets. He was an entertainer, not a soldier, and his story was just another part of the show. Amidst all these fabricated human survivors, the only officially recognized survivor from the 5 companies annihilated with Custer was not a man at all, it was a horse. Comanche, the mount of Captain Miles Keogh, was discovered on the battlefield 2 days later, severely wounded but still alive. The horse was nursed back to health by the Army and became a living, breathing symbol of the disaster. He was granted the equivalent of an honorable retirement, excused from all duties and officially designated as a regimental mascot. He became a celebrity in his own right, a poignant and lonely reminder of the men who did not come back. Crucially, the entire sole survivor narrative relies on a popular misunderstanding. The legend of the Last Stand often implies that the entire 7th Cavalry Regiment was wiped from existence that day. This is fundamentally untrue. While Custer and the 5 companies under his direct command were indeed killed to a man, the other half of his regiment, under the command of Major Marcus Reno and Captain Frederick Benteen, survived. Those hundreds of soldiers fought their own desperate battle several miles away, successfully defending a hilltop position against overwhelming attacks for nearly 2 days until reinforcements arrived. There were, in fact, hundreds of survivors from the 7th Cavalry at the Little Bighorn, but their story was one of a desperate, gritty, and controversial siege, not the clean romantic tragedy of a last stand. History and Hollywood prefer the simplicity of total annihilation, so the complex truth of Reno and Benteen's survival is often pushed to the margins in favor of the more potent myths born from Custer's final, fatal moments. In the immediate aftermath of the Little Bighorn, America was reeling. The country, celebrating its centennial, couldn't process the news of a catastrophic military defeat at the hands of those they considered savages. They needed a hero. They needed a story that could transform a shocking failure into a noble tragedy. And so, the myth of Custer's Last Stand was born, and at its heart was an even more powerful fiction, the story of Custer's last bullet. T-Hay. He narrative quickly took root, spreading through newspapers and word of mouth. The image was irresistible. General George Armstrong Custer, the golden-haired boy general, surrounded by his fallen men, seeing no hope of survival and no possibility of rescue. Rather than face the humiliation of capture and the imagined horrors of torture, he raises his service revolver to his own temple and, with his final round, takes his own life. This image of defiant suicide became the ultimate symbol of American grit. It was painted, sculpted, written into dime novels, and eventually burned into the national consciousness by Hollywood. It was the perfect ending for a nation that refused to accept the reality of the situation. It preserved Custer's pride and framed his death as a final act of control. The only problem is, it almost certainly never happened. The story is a complete fabrication, a piece of heroic fiction undone by the simple, grim facts of the case. The truth lies not in legend, but in the testimony of the men who were actually there and, most importantly, in the silent evidence left on Custer's body itself. The first person to professionally examine the dead was Dr. Henry Porter, a surgeon who had survived the battle with Reno's command. His findings were clear and damning to the suicide myth. Custer had suffered 2 fatal gunshot wounds. One was to his left chest, just below the heart. The other was to his left temple. Either wound would have killed him instantly. But the wound to the temple, the supposed proof of suicide, was missing one crucial element: powder burns. A pistol fired at point-blank range against the skin leaves a distinct tattoo of burnt gunpowder around the entry wound. Custer's body had no such markings. This forensic fact alone makes the suicide theory virtually impossible. He was shot from a distance, not by his own hand. This evidence is corroborated by the men who buried him, soldiers from the commands of Major Reno and Captain Benteen, who had the horrific task of interring the mutilated bodies of their comrades 2 days after the battle, saw Custer's remains up close. While their accounts sometimes varied on minor details, not a single one of them ever reported seeing evidence of a suicide. They saw the 2 wounds, but they saw them for what they were: the result of combat. If there had been any indication that their commander had taken his own life, it would have been the most significant and talked about detail of the burial, yet a profound silence on the matter exists in their accounts. Perhaps the most compelling evidence against the myth comes from the victors themselves. The Lakota and Cheyenne warriors who defeated the 7th Cavalry were meticulous observers of their enemy's conduct. To the warriors of the plains, courage in battle was the highest virtue, and suicide was its polar opposite. It was considered an act of profound cowardice. Had Custer killed himself, it would not have been seen as a heroic last act. It would have been seen as a disgrace. Warriors like White Bull and Two Moons gave detailed accounts of the battle's final moments, and while their stories differ, they all agree on one thing. Custer fought until he was shot down by his enemies. The idea that they would fail to mention or even invent a story to cover up an enemy commander's cowardly suicide makes no sense. Defeating a brave man who fought to the end was an honor. Finding the body of a man who had taken his own life would have been a point of mockery, not reverence. The consensus among modern historians is nearly unanimous. Custer died fighting. The myth of his suicide was created later, a comforting lie to soften the blow of a humiliating and total defeat. The myths surrounding the Little Bighorn didn't just appear out of nowhere. They were a necessary anesthetic for a nation in shock. In the 19th century, America ran on simple narratives of heroes and villains, of righteous progress against a savage frontier. Custer's defeat was a glitch in that programming, a spectacular failure that needed to be explained away. These fictions, from phantom geniuses to fake survivors, provided an easier story to digest. They were born from a deep-seated racial prejudice that could not accept that Native American warriors had intellectually and militarily outmaneuvered the U.S. Army. It was more comforting to invent a rogue, white-educated leader than to credit the strategic brilliance of men like Crazy Horse and Gall. And once created, these stories were amplified by a burgeoning mass media machine, from cheap dime novels to epic Hollywood films, which cemented the lies into the foundation of American pop culture. Peeling back these layers of myth is more than a historical exercise. It's an act of correction. Debunking the legends allows us to see the event with clarity. It restores complexity to figures like Custer, who was neither a martyr nor a monster, but a reckless and ambitious commander. More importantly, it rightfully credits the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho forces with their victory, acknowledging their superior strategy and fierce determination to protect their families and land. The story of Little Bighorn serves as a perfect case study in how history is not just what happens, but who gets to tell the story. By dissecting these myths, we learn how narratives can be deliberately shaped for political and cultural purposes, a lesson that is more relevant than ever. It encourages a critical eye, reminding us to always question the official story and to look for the truth that lies buried beneath the legend. Custer's last bullet wasn't for himself, it was just the final shot in a battle he had already lost. The legend of a heroic end was simply a better story than the truth of a catastrophic failure. The fighting at Little Bighorn was over in hours, but the battle over its myth rages on. Subscribe for more history that cuts through the legend.